Hi again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome to your last lesson for the semester. Now we're discussing two specific movements that kind of piggyback on one another, one called Romanticism and one called Transcendentalism. Okay, these are two major literary and artistic movements that occurred during the 19th century. Okay, so this is, again, the last century that we have been building up to the entire semester now. Now, as for Romanticism, this is something that actually ends up overlapping a little bit with the era of the Enlightenment. And part of the reason is because Romanticism becomes a larger artistic movement that actually, in many ways, ends up opposing the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment is more about logic and reason, science and exploration, and Romanticism is very much in the opposite direction of all of that, right? It's the embrace of emotion, of religious and spiritual experience, of sensory experience, and that sort of thing. Okay, so this begins sometime around 1770 and extends all the way up until the end of the American Civil War, right around 1865. And as I said, this is a much larger movement in response to the Enlightenment. So it's not quite as much as the Great Awakening, right? This is less about religion, more so than it is about just the human experience, more than anything. And again, it embraces the ideas of emotion, of sensory experience, and spiritualism over the ideas of reason and logic. Okay? And we also begin to see revivals of things like classical storytelling, classical mythology, Greek and Roman mythology in particular. We see a revival of medievalism. Okay, so this is where we start to see a lot of the resurgence of things like the King Arthur legends, romances between lovers, Tristan and Isolde, right? These kinds of characters. And there's a large movement, again, toward the idea of getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life and kind of reverting back to almost this, it's almost like a form of escapism for people at the time. Okay? And so we also see things like the Victorian revival of fairies, right? The idea that, there's these magical creatures that live off in the woods somewhere that are, perhaps in good standing with humans and perhaps not. Okay? So there are 5 principles that go along with Romanticism here that are worthy of mention. Okay? First thing that has been uncommon until now is the idea that there is an interest in the common man and in childhood in particular. Okay? This idea that we're not so much concerned about those who are wealthy or influential. We're more concerned about individuals whose stories don't often get told. Okay? And when it comes to childhood in particular, we're looking more at innocence, okay? Or in some cases, even the loss thereof. Again, going back to this constant undercurrent of emotions, feelings, and senses, these are used to varying degrees by authors during the time period, and not always in a bright and happy way either. Okay? One of the most influential authors of the time period, of course, is Edgar Allan Poe. Okay? So, and believe it or not, he is actually considered a romanticist because he actually embodies the emotions of terror, of disgust, of horror, right? Things that most people at the time were keen to stay away from. Okay? So individuals like him, Emily Dickinson, who struggles quite a bit with depression, Nathaniel Hawthorne with the darker side of humanity, right? So Romanticism is not always about happy and good feelings, right? Sometimes it's about embracing the horrible feelings of being a human. And humans also at this point start to gain a little bit of a better sense of awe when it comes to nature. Okay, when we look at individuals like Henry David Thoreau, who writes Walden Pond, we look at Walt Whitman, who writes Leaves of Grass. There's this large sort of pantheistic ideology that goes with this. In some cases, individuals go so far as to say that God exists in nature at this point in time, right? That you can find the miracle of creation under every leaf and every rock and so forth, and the face of every child and that sort of thing. So there's a greater sense of this almost childlike innocence that goes along with being a romanticist. And there's a greater celebration of the individual, too. Okay, so people who embrace romantic ideologies tend to be very nonconformist. Okay, so guys like Henry Thoreau go off to live in the woods by themselves for 2 years. Right, they grow a long beard, they wear a funny hat, and they stand out from society when they come back into the city of any kind. And the importance of the imagination is really, again, at the heart and soul of Romanticism here. Okay, so again, whether it's used for something positive or something negative, this is, again, something that can't be escaped in the midst of all this. And to take it a step further, we go into talking about Transcendentalism. Okay, and this is something that is a little bit more isolated in time, right? This is something that happens around the 1820s or 1830s. And the whole idea of Transcendentalism is the idea of being able to somehow transcend or get out of mundane life through artistic expression, right? Whether through its painting or literature or music, whatever it happens to be, right? There's a way of transcending this dull and somewhat meaningless life, working day to day for a pittance or something like that, to actually have some kind of spiritual fulfillment. And the whole key feature here of Transcendentalism is the idea that there is an inherent goodness in people and in nature. And some people might argue that this borders on the naive. Okay, not everybody is, predisposed to being a good person, and not all of nature is very hospitable to humans, for that matter. But it's the idea that somehow if we can live in harmony with one another and with nature, then things will be a little bit better. Okay, so, and you might see that this is somewhat of a predecessor to the counterculture movement that we see in the 1960s, right? The idea of the hippies saying, why can't we all just get along, make love, not war, that whole thing. Okay, so it's very similar to that, just roughly a century earlier. And the ideas of self-reliance and independence are another thing that many transcendentalists end up embodying. Henry David Thoreau, in particular, writing Walden Pond, again, he goes off to live by himself in the woods for 2 years. Okay? He ends up cutting his own, cutting logs, building his own cabin, fishing, painting, gardening, right? And he spends the entire time away from humans. He doesn't speak to anybody for months, if not years. And the idea here, too, is that we're subjecting ourselves to the idea of objective empiricism too much. This idea that if we listen to what other people have to say and we try to take a cold, hard look at everything in life, and if we don't have a sense of humor, if we don't have a sense of awe, then we're really not gaining the whole human experience. Okay? So being open to subjective intuition is something that is a big part of Transcendentalism, right? If you really are going to transcend, you need to open yourself up to whatever possibilities exist. And finally here, the idea of trying to intellectualize or institutionalize spiritual beliefs is something that most Transcendentalists want nothing to do with, right? They don't believe in listening necessarily to a priest or to someone who is supposed to be wiser than they are. They believe that everybody is open and equal when it comes to this kind of thing. So now that you've looked at some of this, head on over to the discussion board and take a look at some of the examples I've got for you. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you around.